last 15 years. And when I realized, I went back and looked at it, of the six largest shipwrecks on Lake Michigan, four had been found. So I had to go back and redo a substantial amount of the talk, but I was happy to do it. So a little bit about my background that's going to be germane to the presentation. I've been researching Great Lakes shipwrecks for about 30, 40 years. And I grew up in the Keweenaw Peninsula on Lake Superior, and I got really interested in the shipwrecks up there. And I realized that, there was a lot of stuff that had been done, a lot of research, but I kept finding, new accounts, new shipwrecks, especially up in the Keweenaw waterway that nobody had looked into. And I started to do my own research, and that became really important for understanding, shipwrecks, because there are constantly new historical accounts being found, new ships being discovered. And so not only am I interested in the shipwrecks of the Keweenaw Peninsula, but also of the Beaver and Fox Island groups. I have a manuscript that I've been working on all the shipwrecks there. As you can see, I've visited a lot of those wrecks and dived them or mapped them. I also have a book on Wisconsin's lost ships, over 300 lost ships in southeastern Wisconsin that I wrote about 15 years ago. I also do wreck hunting. So I'm out doing, remote sensing with side scan sonar. This past year, my partner Bob and I found three historic shipwrecks. The most notable is probably the schooner Trinidad off Algoma, Wisconsin, which was completely intact in about 260 feet of water. Some of you may also know me through my work in Great Lakes antiquities. I collect rare and early Great Lakes books, maps, ephemera, photos, postcards. But most of you maybe know me through the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, the social media community that I founded and coordinate on Facebook. I also do quite a bit of work. I am the president of the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association, and we do work primarily in Wisconsin waters, documenting sites with the State Historical Society here. I'm also very active in the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History. This is an umbrella organization of over 100 maritime museums and historical societies with a Great Lakes emphasis. It's an excellent group. They meet with a big conference every year at a different maritime museum around the Great Lakes. And by being a member, I got to know pretty much all the different maritime museums and people that are active. So that was really useful. I'm also active in the Wisconsin Maritime Museum, and I sit on the board of the Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast National Marine Sanctuary. So, the big thing that I like to do is I like to tell the stories of lost ships. And I like to tell new stories, stories that haven't been told before. And in order to do that, you have to do original research. And by original research, I mean, finding, information that hasn't been found before, right? Not just reading somebody else's book and rehashing what, say, Fred Stonehouse said, or, what somebody else said in their own research. So I want to talk a little bit about missing ships on the lakes. So there are, obviously quite a lot of missing ships. I'm going to take you into some numbers on these, and it's important to understand the numbers of missing ships if you want to talk about how many are still lost on the Great Lakes. So one of the things that I do is I look at, empirical data, like databases. There are still a lot of ships that are obviously missing out there. Here on the bottom right, you see the Marquette and Bessemer #2, which is, it's astounding that it's still missing on Lake Erie. It's a 330-foot long piece of steel, almost the size of a city block in a lake that averages 60 feet deep, right? There are other giant ships like the Carruthers that you see in the upper right, the biggest ship still missing on the Great Lakes. It's not been found. And there are reasons these haven't been found. But the first thing I want to do is take you into sort of a Great Lakes shipwrecks by the numbers to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So there are a lot of stats I'm going to talk about here, but I'm going to tell you how we know that these numbers are accurate, because you hear a lot of numbers bounced around about how many shipwrecks are on the lakes. And, some people think we pull those out of the air. The actual fact is we don't. We have very good data. So we know, for example, that about 40,000 commercial vessels have sailed the lakes between 1678 and 1960. How do we know this? Well, first of all, the big reason we do is that there are a number of really good databases, right? The historian Chuck Feltner did a database of all the vessel enrollments that were in the master abstracts at the National Archives, right? All vessels on the Great Lakes had to be enrolled at a customs house after the War of 1812, roughly. Prior to the War of 1812, those were all mostly military vessels, and they're all well documented. So we have good records on those. And we have excellent records then from the War of 1812 up to 1900 from the Great Lakes Customs House enrollment records. And those are all in databases too. But the most interesting database, and the one that gives us the best data, is one that not many people know about. There was a marine historian named Herman Runge in Milwaukee in the 1900s. And in 1992, I was hired to transcribe all of his vessel data cards. And this guy made a card for every ship that ever sailed on the Great Lakes. Between 1900 and 1958, the cards are very accurate. He went through the annual lists of U.S. merchant vessels. He went through all these marine registers, and he literally made a card for every one. And so it took me about 2 years with other volunteers to make this database, but it has about 30,000 records for Great Lakes vessels. And if you add to that the early vessels and some of the others, we know that there are about 40,000 commercial vessels that have sailed the Great Lakes. Interestingly enough, about 8,000 shipwrecks have occurred on the lakes or are on the lakes. When we talk about shipwrecks, it's important that we define what we mean by shipwreck, right? Not everything that divers dive on the Great Lakes is there because of an accident. There are lots of old hulks sunk in rivers and harbors that were not the result of an accident. They were just scuttled, or old hulls that have been towed out. There are perfectly intact schooners, on all 5 Great Lakes that have been just towed out of harbors and scuttled in 200 feet of water. And they're very historically important, and people call them shipwrecks, but they're not in the accident databases because they weren't lost due to an accident. So what we know is that there really are about 600 actual shipwrecks that occurred from accidents. How do we know that? The main reason is the David Swayze Shipwreck Database, which I host on my website. If you go to www.shipwreck.info/Swayze, Swayze, you can get to it. It's searchable. That database was created over about 20 years by about 15 of the leading researchers on the Great Lakes, myself included. And we all contributed wrecks from the lakes that we were on, like Jerry Metzler on Lake Erie, Richard Palmer on Lake Ontario, a number of us on Lake Michigan, several researchers on Lake Superior. We all did original research and we contributed wrecks to it. And of course, all the wrecks that were in the various books got in. And after we were done, there were about 5,000 shipwrecks in the database. We know that we haven't got them all. There are some that we believe we missed. There are also some smaller vessels like fish tugs and things that aren't in there yet. So we know that the number is pretty close to 6,000. It's not more than that. And we know it's more than 5,000. These are commercial vessels that were lost as a result of an accident. They never sailed again. They may or may not have extant remains, right? Of those 600 shipwrecks, probably a lot of them, were cut up, burned, what have you. This does not include vessels that were recovered, things that were intentionally scuttled, or losses to modern yachts and pleasure boats. Because after 1960, a lot of these yachts were registered as in the annual list of U.S. merchant vessels, but every Chris Craft that burned, for example, off Chicago, and there are dozens of them, is not in the database because they're just not commercial vessels. All right. Moving on, there have been 4,000 of the shipwrecks, of the 8,000 things that we call a shipwreck, that have extant remains. What I mean by that is they're, either out in the lake, under beaches, or scattered on reefs, or sunk in rivers and harbors, right? There's about 4,000 things that we call shipwrecks. And maritime archaeologists love these, whether they're lost through an accident, whether they're, buried under a parking lot. They're all Great Lakes shipwrecks to them. Of those, we think about 3,000 have been identified. So these are things that peek out from under beaches, right? Where, we know that there's a shipwreck that, a keel and ribs that peeks out from under the beach. Wayne Lusardi, Michigan State underwater archaeologist, went over and identified it, right? Or deep diveable wrecks, things like things in the underwater preserve system, or deep wrecks that have been found and identified. There are about 3,000 of those. Of those, about 1,000 are considered dive sites, right? Things that divers go and visit. So those are some of the more interesting numbers. One of the things I want to point out that a lot of people aren't aware of is the frequency of wrecks on the lake. Comes from Swayze's database. And Swayze's database, with about 5,000 wrecks, is big enough and it represents a large enough population that you can make, you know, valid statistical observations about the percentages of wrecks. What we know from Swayze's database is that Lake Michigan has 26.5% of the wrecks that are in that database. Lake Huron has 26.1%, Lake Erie has 23.8%, Lake Ontario has 12%, Lake Superior has 11.5%. Why might that be? Well, Lake Michigan has a lot of wrecks because it has a lot of cities. That's the same thing with Lake Erie. Lake Huron has a lot of wrecks because it was the main transit lake. If you wanted to, almost all the goods on the Great Lakes that were involved in trans-lake commerce came out of Lake Superior and Lake Michigan and went to Lake Erie. And to do that, they had to go through Lake Huron. Why does Lake Superior have so few? It's because it doesn't have very many large cities, very few small vessels. It wasn't open until the Soo Locks were opened in 1855. And it primarily saw large vessel traffic, right? So things that weren't easy to sink. Likewise, Lake Ontario, in many ways, is similar to Lake Superior. You know, you couldn't get there except through the Welland Canal. There weren't a lot of large cities. Oswego was probably the biggest American city. And so there wasn't a lot of shipping. Now, you do hear a lot of people saying that Lake Erie has the most wrecks. That's actually, I think, disprovable. And I know that I'll hurt a lot of people's feelings on Lake Erie, but this data doesn't have a sampling bias. We think the reason Lake Erie has fewer wrecks is a few reasons. One is that it didn't have the number of small vessels that were involved in commerce in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s that Lake Michigan did that were prone to wreck. Lake Erie is also shallow. If you sink in 55 feet of water, guess what? The ship's probably going to get raised, right? Most of the ships that went missing or that were lost and were true shipwrecks in Lake Erie were lost off Long Point in the big deep hole that's off Long Point. So really, Lake Michigan leads the Great Lakes in shipwrecks, regardless of what you may see elsewhere. And I think it's empirically provable. So that's a little bit about the numbers. Now let's talk about the numbers of ships that are still missing. By this, I mean ships that sank or were sunk offshore and haven't been found. This does not include vessels that broke up on reefs or that went aground or that were scuttled in rivers and harbors. These are not missing ships. Those are ships we kind of know where they are, right? So you can see if you look at the numbers of shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, there are patterns. This is from Calvin Deviney's Great Lakes shipwreck maps, which are very rare. I think I own one of the only extant copies, but you can get to see the spatial dispersion of Great Lakes shipwrecks on Lake Michigan, for example. You see things like the Great Lakes Triangle really aren't true, right? Wrecks tend to concentrate around port cities and around places where there's a lot of vessel traffic. And that's true on Lake Michigan, and it's true on Lake Erie, where you see Long Point here has a lot, and Dunkirk, and the various port cities have a lot of shipwrecks. So how many are there? Well, it turns out that Lake Michigan has about 200 ships that are still missing, meaning they sank out in the lake in deep water and have never been found. Lake Erie has about 150. Lake Huron only has about 100. Lake Ontario and Lake Superior each have about 50. Why so few on these two? Well, again, it's because Lake Superior had mostly large vessels, large ships. They didn't sink very often. The few that are still missing out there are mostly big vessels, and they're out in deep water. Lake Huron has quite a few because it was, like I say, a big transit lake. Lake Erie has a lot because it had a lot of cities and a lot of wrecks. And of course, Lake Michigan had a ton. It had a lot more small vessel traffic. It had a lot more fish tugs, a lot more little coastal trading schooners, and then a lot of deep water for them to get lost in, and a lot of little port cities. If you look at the coastline, how much coastline Lake Michigan has and how many port cities it has more than Lake Erie, and it's got more coastline. And that's why it has more wrecks. So if you don't believe me, this is, and I know you won't be able to read this, but these are the 200 undiscovered Lake Michigan shipwrecks that foundered offshore. This is from my own database. And if you go quick, you can screenshot it, but I can give you the data if you want. There are 200 or so. I would say this isn't a complete list, but it's within, plus or minus 5% And I've got this listed in order of size, from biggest to smallest. You can see the end is a lot of little fish tugs, middle is a lot of schooners. But these are all shipwrecks that I've researched. Like every one of these I know about. I've read about, I've researched, I've gone to the news microfilms on them, and I can tell you their story and where they are. There's a reason they haven't been found, and we'll get into that. All right. So let's talk a little bit about overall Great Lakes shipwrecks. So one of the things you're going to notice is that a lot of shipwrecks are being found. These were the top 20 biggest missing ships on the Great Lakes in 2010. Those in bold have been found since 2010. That's fully half of the shipwrecks. The largest shipwrecks on the Great Lakes were found. Who is finding these? How are they finding them, and why? Well, at least one of the guys is watching this tonight that's finding them. There are a lot of people who are doing this because these are interesting historical artifacts, right? They're extremely important historical objects. They tell stories about our cultural heritage here on the Great Lakes. We were the furnace that fired the Industrial Revolution. The Great Lakes supplied all the copper, the steel, the lumber, the raw materials that built America. And these ships were, the vehicles that did it. And they have some tragic and harrowing stories, and they also have a shelf life. So what I mean by that is that these things aren't going to be there in 100 years. They're not going to be in perfect condition. These metal wrecks deteriorate, and we see it already on like the car ferry Milwaukee. It's collapsing into the bottom of Lake Michigan. So these are a perishable resource, and there's some urgency to find them, to tell their stories. One of the other reasons people want to find them is because NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Aeronautical Administration, has said that they want to map all 5 Great Lakes by 2030. And they will find these big wrecks. Now, they won't find all the wrecks. They're using multi-beam sonar, which isn't the best tool for finding shipwrecks. It's good for mapping the bottom, but not for finding these smaller wrecks. But they'll find the big ones. And so a lot of these wreck hunters want to find them first because NOAA doesn't tell their stories. NOAA just turns them over to the states. His historical preservation officer, who may or may not reveal that they were found. So there's an urgency to find them for a couple of reasons. So what you can see here is that the Henry B. Smith has been found. The Steinbrenner was just found. The Cypress, the Hydrus, the Scotia Dock, the deepest wreck on the Great Lakes, the big automobile carrier, the Senator, and of course the Père Marquette 18. The holy grail of Lake Michigan's big ships was found. And I was involved directly in the discovery of the L.R. Doty in 2010. So a lot of these have been found. Note that some of the lakes have a lot more than others, right? Huron and Superior have a lot of the big ships. So that's because they had larger ship traffic. Michigan has honestly not as many big ships, and it's because we didn't have a lot of big iron ore boats, right? Most of the big ships you're going to see are iron ore carriers, right? And again, of course, the same thing with Erie. It doesn't have too many. It's got 2, the Marquette and Bessemer number 2, which is just a mind-boggling mystery that's still missing. And the Athens, or sorry, and the city of Venice, I mean. So, and then there are none on Lake Ontario. So it's an interesting constellation of wrecks. Likewise, the top 20 on Lake Michigan. These are the 20 biggest that are still missing on Lake Michigan. They're a little smaller, right? The biggest one is only 302 feet. There's only 2 steel steamers out there missing, the Gilcher and the Andasti. The rest of these, a lot of these are wooden vessels, and some of them are even schooners, big schooner barges. And one of the things you're going to notice about the wrecks on Lake Michigan, and you're going to see it when I start talking about them, is these are all far from shore. Lake Michigan had a lot of wreck hunters, and all of the low-hanging fruit was found. So if the wreck is close to shore, chances are it was already located by people and is, in our state's database or is in, an underwater preserve somewhere. These wrecks all have challenges with respect to finding them, and I'll talk about those as we go through. All right. Lastly, I want to talk about not lastly, before I get into the big 6, I want to talk about searching for shipwrecks. I mentioned, why do we do that? The big one is probably that they're archaeological sites for the most part, now, not like, ancient archaeology, but industrial archaeology. They don't make ships like this anymore, and a lot of people want to see these ships. They want to see their steam engines. They want to see how they were built. They want to solve the mystery of what happened to these ships. They're oftentimes really well preserved, but they won't be for long. So we have a lot of people that want to find them. Um, there's a couple of requirements to find these ships. It makes them really hard to find now, the big deep ones, and that's that to find these ships, you need to be able to do original research, right? If you're not going and finding things that other people haven't discovered about the wreck, you're probably not going to find it, right? By original research, I don't mean reading one of Fred Stonehouse's books. I mean, you're getting an account on newspapers.com, or better yet, you're going to the small local papers that aren't yet online, or you're going to the National Archives. So one of the reasons this is important is because new data becomes available every year, and that's the way these are being found. Like, I'll give you an example. About 5 years ago, I was at the National Archives in Chicago, and I asked them for a rec report. I thought I was getting a life-saving service rec report, and they came out with a customs house rec report. I'm like, what? They kept rec reports at the customs houses? Turns out they did. Not many people knew it. And I found a cache of over 8,000 rec reports made out in the captain's own hand, starting in 1873 and going up to 1940. And we worked with the National Archives, the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History. I led a project to digitize all of those rec reports, and we're creating a finding aid right now to make those available online. All three of the shipwrecks that my partner Bob Jake and I found in the last 2 years, we found using their rec reports that came from the National Archives. So keeping current and doing your own research and going to these archives is really important. Likewise, the National Archives has made available their Admiralty case files now. Any ships that collided on the Great Lakes, they have the court cases, and there's some amazing detail in there. I mean, we asked for the court case for the collision that sank the Thomas H. Smith off of Racine, Wisconsin. They had 500 pages from the 1890s of courtroom testimony from the men who were on the boats. It was really impressive. Likewise, there's geomagnetic bottom data available for the Great Lakes, where they've recorded magnetic anomalies on the lake bottom, and certain researchers on the Great Lakes have requested that from the government, and they've discovered how to map that geomagnetic data spatially, and they found shipwrecks. That's how the Henry Steinbrenner, or not Steinbrenner, that's how the Henry B. Smith was found with geomagnetic bottom data. And lastly, this NOAA survey data is coming out. They are starting to release their high resolution bottom data. And I found a shipwreck with Ken Merriman that way, the barge Industry, which is just north of the Beaver Island group. I spotted an anomaly on the NOAA survey data. There was a lump on the bottom, and it was right in the middle of my grid for the Industry. So I asked Ken to check it out. Sure enough, it was the Industry. So these are all new things, new ways these wrecks are being found. Who's looking? Well, the big group that's been finding them is the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, right up on Lake Superior. They found a lot of the big steel ore boats. But also, Jerry Eliason and Ken Merriman have found a lot of the wrecks. Dave Trotter has found a few on Lake Erie. Paul Ehorn looks on Lake Michigan, along with Dusty Cliffman. And Dan Fountain is also a guy who looks for some of the big lost ships. And these are guys who, like me, have been doing it a long time. It's a passion of ours. We like telling these stories, and we think it's fun to look for them. We use remote sensing technology. This is the Wreck Sniffer Mark 1 up here. This is my homemade sonar. One of the reasons these are being found is that, for $1,000, I was able to build this and acquire it, and it'll find a wreck that you needed a $100,000 Klein sonar to find back in the old days, right? You also need a big boat to get out there. A lot of these wrecks are far from shore. This is our little setup that we use. That's probably not big enough to get far from shore. But a lot of these are too deep to dive. So you need an ROV. Like we just bought this chasing ROV that's good down to about 700 feet to look at the wrecks. Because when you run something over, you need to be able to check it out and see what it is. All right, I'm going to move on. So the big six, I'm going to give you a tour of the six largest ships still missing on Lake Michigan, and we'll talk about where they are and some of the difficulties with finding them. So these ships are all mostly far from shore. they have their last known position isn't well documented in many cases. They tend to be in deep water. There's often conflicting accounts of their loss, but they're also relatively obscure outside the maritime history community. So things like, the Charles Stewart Parnell. Who's heard of that? I mean, outside of the geeks, or the Frank L. Vance. These are not household names. So I'm going to take you through from the smallest to the largest, and we'll talk about where these shipwrecks are. What's going to be interesting here, guys, is that I think at least one of these is going to be found or announced soon that it was discovered, and I think you will see the vast majority of these discovered within the next 10 years. So keep an eye out for them. So let's start with the Lac La Belle. So this is a very famous passenger steamer that ran on Lake Michigan between Milwaukee and Grand Haven in the passenger and package freight trade. At 218 feet, she was big for a wooden steamer, and she had to have these arched sides to keep her together. The picture is actually from an original stereo view in my collection that I own. It shows her in Milwaukee in 1870. Now, this vessel was a little suspect because in 1866 she had wrecked in the St. Clair River in a collision, and she spent 3 years on the bottom of the St. Clair River, literally underwater in about 25 feet of water, and they raised her and rebuilt her and put her back in service. So there are some questions about her because of that. Her last trip, she left Milwaukee bound for Grand Haven at 9 p.m. on Sunday, October 13th, 1872. There was a moderate gale blowing. She had about 19,000 bushels of barley, some flour, some pork, and 25 barrels of whiskey, for those of you who are interested in whiskey wrecks. Some animal feed, and she had 53 passengers and crew. About 11 p.m., she was found to be leaking. Her pumps couldn't contain it. It was a heavy leak, and so her captain turned back for Milwaukee. But the storm really increased. Big waves and huge winds coming from the north, and it started to blow her south. A rogue wave came over and boarded her and put out her boiler fires at about midnight, and then she was just driven at the mercy of the storm, just directly south from where she had been. She started to go down by the stern, and at about 5 a.m., and the captain ordered everyone to the lifeboats. They all rowed to shore. Some made it to shore about 6 miles south of Racine, others north of Racine. 8 people died when one of the lifeboats capsized. So where is this wreck? We have an interesting account that comes to us from one of the cooks, who says that he could see the shore about 8 to 10 miles distant when they got in the lifeboats. Now that's at odds with what the captain said, that they were 25 miles from shore. What we know is that she was on this line going across the lake. She lost her engines and she blew down this way. We knew the wind is generally out of the north, and it swung around out of the northeast. So we think it took her a little closer to shore. The accounts vary between 8 and 25 miles where she actually is. I think she's probably just a little north of Racine because of where the lifeboats came ashore. You can see here the dots are where the lifeboats came ashore. It's unclear to me how far out she was when her engines died, but we think she would have been about 25 miles out, and then she blew closer. This is what the bottom looks like where she went down. It's between 250 and 410 feet deep in that grid. Why hasn't this been found? Well, it's a big grid. I don't look for a ship unless the grid is 5 miles by 5 miles or less. That's 25 square miles. This is an 80 square mile grid. This is going to take you a month of Sundays to search. So I know people look for this wreck. It's a far from shore wreck. You need a boat that gets gallons to the mile, not miles to the gallon, to go look for this. It would be a cool find. This is a ship that was a beautiful passenger steamer. She's in probably her upper works blew off, but it would be an interesting wreck to find, and it would do a lot to solve the mystery, to tell the story of what went wrong with her. One of the accounts states, that they think that she struck an embankment and knocked out one of her stern deadlights, and that's how the water came on board. So it'll be interesting to find her and see if that's true. All right, next up is this kind of a similar vessel in a way. It's a package freighter called the Java. This is in Michigan waters, and this is an iron-hulled vessel. This ship could have lasted, oh God, some of her sisters lasted almost to World War II. She was built in 1873 at Buffalo. This is not a photo of her. This is her sister Arabia. She was one of five identical sisters: the Russia, the Cuba, the Scotia, and the Arabia. The Russia and the Scotia wrecked. The Scotia is up on Keweenaw Point in Lake Superior. The Russia was just found in the Detour Passage. But Cuba and Arabia had long careers. This is also from an original stereo view in my collection that I own, an H. Bennett stereo view showing the Arabia in Milwaukee. She was bound from Bay City, Michigan. She was heading for Chicago and then to Milwaukee. She had a cargo full of package freight. She was lost on Sunday, August 18th, 1878, off Big Sable Point. So she had an interesting cargo. Really, she was carrying a lot of salt from Bay City, but she also had parlor stoves, refined household goods, furniture, some pretty interesting stuff. She left Bay City on August 17th. And by 8 a.m. the next day, she was off Big Sable Point, and when there was a loud bang heard. Um, Most historians believe that a big log got lodged in her starboard prop, and it broke the shaft of her propeller inside the boat. So, it didn't shear off the blades, but the shaft broke inside the stuffing box. And then it slid out of her stern. Now, she was a twin propeller. She had two props. So this would have been her starboard prop. And when it slid out, water just rushed in. That's the theory. The crew immediately took to the lifeboats, and the vessel went down by the stern in under 30 minutes. The schooner J.P. Marsh hove to the scene and rescued all the crew. What's interesting about this particular wreck is that we have these accounts of four different schooners being anchored over the site, and that all of these fine household goods were actually floating to the surface, and these schooners were throwing their own deckloads of lumber overboard to make room for the goods that they were salvaging off of the Java. Um, and so you can see that here. The Java, there's an article saying that they think she's in water from 200 to 250 feet deep, and that no salvage diver could go down that far. They also have an article about these schooners being, anchored together over the wreck, taking stuff as things floated up off of her. So where was she? Well, off Big Sable Point is about all we get. Now, one of the things that the accounts say is that she was 15 miles out. I don't think that's true. One of the things we know is that these vessels stayed on the shipping lanes, right? You don't make money if you don't take the quickest distance between 2 points, especially in a steam vessel. You stay on the lane, on the compass heading. And so this vessel should have been really about 5 statute miles off of Big Sable Point if she was going to be on the line for that shipping lane, not 15 miles out. And that actually corresponds nicely to the depth that they ascribed to her. But if she was any further out, she would be in fairly deep water. So this wreck has been searched for. She's probably the 250 depth actually doesn't match the 15 miles out. So it's a big grid, I guess is what I'm saying. Somewhere off of Big Sable Point in a grid of about 10 miles by, I'd say, 8 miles, 80 square miles again. On the bottom lies this really important, historically important iron-hulled steamer, the Java. I think there's a reason she hasn't been searched for much, and that's because it's just such a big grid. Now, the big question is, were these schooners really anchored? Could they drop their hooks and anchor on this wreck? If they could, if they were truly anchored, then this depth of 200 to 250 feet might be accurate. But it could be they were just anchored together, rafted together. I don't know. There's a lot of news articles about this one. So, interesting wreck. Let's move on. I got to make some time here. The Andasti is the next one. This one is a well-known wreck. It's a steel steamer, 267 feet when built, 247 feet when lost. She was lost September 9th, 1929, bound from Grand Haven to Chicago with a sand and gravel cargo. This vessel went out in a terrible storm in 1929 with winds of about 60 miles an hour. And all that was known is that debris started to wash up on shore. All the crew were lost, 25 to 29 people. 16 bodies were recovered. A lot were wearing life jackets, so they kind of knew that the end was coming. She was last seen by the passenger steamer Alabama about mid-lake, southwest of Holland, Michigan. The Andasti was west-northwest of the Alabama at a distance of about 8 to 10 miles at 2 a.m. during this big storm, and that was the last that was seen of her. So we can make some predictions about where this vessel could be. Um, we know that she was on a line, from Grand Haven to Chicago. So if you draw that line, she'd be on it. The problem is the box is real big. We don't know how far she made it. Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates actively looks for this vessel. They actually found the steamer Milwaukee last year looking for the Andasti. And what you get to see is, she's right on the edge of this deep area between these two X's, we think. And again, this is a huge grid. It's far from shore. It costs a lot of money to get out there. You need a powerful side scan, and you're starting to get into water that's 400 feet deep out here. And so there's some pretty good reasons why the Andasti hasn't been found. She will be found someday, whether it's by MSRA or by NOAA. But when she's found, it'll be an interesting story to tell because I suspect she capsized. She fell into the trough of the seas. This vessel was a modified whaleback, a semi-whaleback. You can see that. And there's really no examples of other whalebacks capsizing, but this one wasn't a true whaleback, and it's possible she capsized. There's just a ton of debris that came ashore, and a lot of people, have, artifacts and debris from this wreck that MSRA has documented. So this is probably one of the most difficult searches of the Big Six, but the one that's best known and the one that people are actually looking for. All right. Next two I'm going to go over pretty quick because they burned. The Charles Stewart Parnell was a big wooden steamer. She was lost on Wednesday, November 29th, 1905, when she burned and sank 7 miles west of Squaw Island, northwest of the Beaver Group. The ship had very few known photos, but a couple of drawings. The crew were eating Thanksgiving dinner when her coal cargo was found to be on fire. She was heading from Buffalo to Chicago with coal. There was a pretty good sea running at the time. The steamer Harlem was nearby and saw the ship burning. The crew boarded the vessel and actually took a line to her and tried to tow her into the shallows, even though the Parnell had been abandoned. Her crew was already out in the lifeboats. They didn't get the vessel towed to the shallows. It actually burned through the tow line before they could. But there was a big controversy. The Harlem's captain submitted a $10,000 bill to the Parnell's owners for the rescue attempt. And of course, they lost in court. But now this is an interesting wreck because in 1909, they actually found this vessel, allegedly in 200 feet of water, and were able to salvage some of the coal. And that's known. That's a fact. They found the Parnell wreck. It's in the newspapers. And the steamer Albert Soper actually took 600 tons of anthracite off of her. They say that they did it with means of a diving bell in 200 feet of water in 1909. I'm not buying it. I think this wreck is shallower than that. She was on the shipping lane. This is Squaw Island right here. This is the grid that I think she's in. They would have made their turn. The accounts say she was 6 to 7 miles northwest of Squaw Island when she was lost. And that would make sense because the shipping lane goes right over a feature called the Mackinac Channel, which is a glacial river channel. And it runs out this way and then down this way. And it's much deeper. This orange stuff is all like 50 feet deep. If you want to be in 150 feet of water, you've got to be in this channel. So we think that the Parnell is sitting in the Mackinac Channel in deeper water, probably not 200 feet, maybe 100 feet deep, but she's still got to be in the channel. I think this has probably got the smallest search grid of any of the wrecks, but it probably won't be found very quickly because it's hard to get out there. It's not a very sexy wreck. It's burned. Not many people know about it. And it's expensive, You got to go to Beaver Island and get a slip there and then run up here. It's a long way to go. All right. Next up is the Frank L. Vance. The Vance was a big wooden steamer, 258 feet. She burned and sank Tuesday, October 4th, 1910, out in the middle of the lake, 20 to 30 miles southeast of Ludington. She was bound from Toledo from Milwaukee with coal. And we know this one pretty well because she was on a shipping lane from Ludington to Milwaukee. She had stopped at at Ludington, and she left Ludington at 5 a.m. It wasn't long after, 3.5 hours later, fire was discovered in her aft hold. Two big steamers, the Paramount 19 and the Maggie Marshall, stood by, and trained hoses on the coal cargo, trying to put it out without success. They took the crew off, and the last that was known, they said they expected her boilers to explode because they couldn't get the fire out, and they figured that would send her to the bottom. This ship sent one of the first wireless messages after the Paramarquette 18 went down earlier that year, sending a wireless. The Frank L. Vance sent a wireless also and gotten word out of the disaster. This is actually the crew on the deck. She had a history of burning. This vessel, for whatever reason, it burned like 3 or 4 times. She's also got a prohibitively large grid, but one of the things we know about her is that she's on the shipping lane here from Ludington, probably right out, I think they said 20 to 30 some miles out. We don't know exactly how far, but we do within about 8 miles of where she is on the shipping lane. So if you were to run this shipping lane and just do passes back and forth, you probably could find her. The big one about this wreck is she out on the Mid-Lake Plateau? So you can see there's this deep Ludington basin here, but the Mid-Lake Plateau rises up to about 120 feet out here in the middle, and right out on this edge, it's maybe, 250 feet deep. So if she's up on the edge, she could be, an interesting wreck to look at. We don't know for sure. Obviously, I think she'll be the last found, honestly, even though she may be one of the simpler wrecks to find because she's just going to be on that shipping lane. I think she'll be the last found. It's far from shore. She's burned. All right, here's the Mac Daddy, the W.H. Gilcher. This is a 302-foot steel steamer. She was built in 1891 at Cleveland, lost Friday, October 28th, 1892 off South Fox Island, a giant storm. She was bound from Buffalo to Milwaukee with coal. The ship had a short career. There's only one known photo of her. That's this one right up here in the corner. This is her captain and crew. There's an artist's conception of her, and that's it. Her sister was the ill-fated Western Reserve, which is still missing on Lake Superior and is one of the largest vessels still missing on the Great Lakes. These vessels were widely attributed to have faulty marine steel. They were two of the first big steel steamers made, and there were advances made in the quality of and consistency of marine steel as a result of these 2 vessels being lost. We know the Western Reserve broke in half because there was a survivor that attested to it. I suspect when this wreck is found, she'll be found in 2 pieces. She was last seen 15 miles west of South Fox Island by the captain of the schooner Seaman. She was barely making any headway in the storm. Her propeller was slowly turning, not really underway. Bodies from the wreck came ashore at South Fox Island and on North Manitou Island. All 18 of her crew were lost without any survivors. Now, the interesting factor is that a schooner called the Ostrich capsized and drove ashore on South Manitou Island in the same storm. All her crew were lost. There was a lot of speculation that she collided with the Gilcher. I don't think that's the case. I think they were lost independently. It was a violent enough storm for both those vessels to be lost. I think the Gilcher will be found broken in half. This was also not a particularly violent storm for the Gilcher. The Gilcher at a 302-foot steel steamer should have been able to handle it. So we do think that, there may have been problems with her steel. There have been reports of her discovery which have been easily discounted over the years. The Gilcher has not been found, although people are looking for her. She's probably one of the hardest wrecks to find. She's far from land. The Foxes don't have any harbors or moorings or docks. So if you want to get out there, you just sort of anchor around the Foxes and then go 15 miles out into the middle of the lake off the Foxes. We don't know how far this vessel drifted after the seamen saw her. So we know that she was last seen here between 2 and 2:20 in the morning, clearing the straits. 8 o'clock, she's last seen by the schooner seamen. The seamen thought she was at anchor, which is not possible, given the depth of the water. But she was certainly just trying to keep her nose into the wind. The average depth of where she is thought to lie is pretty deep. It's around 500 feet. This is a bathymetric of the bottom, and this whole grid is all dark blue. It's a deep part of the lake. Unless she's out here on this little ridge feature, she's going to be in deep water, or if she blew down here. But we think the wind was out of the north. I don't think she made it very far before she broke in half. Um, all right. So, and this is the account of the schooner Seaman, um, and citing her. Captain Duncan Buchanan was the last person ever to see the Gilcher on the surface. So that uh, those are the big six. And like I said, if you keep your eye on the media, you're going to see a lot of these wrecks are going to be found. And I wouldn't doubt that you're going to see some of the big ones that are still missing on the Great Lakes in general that haven't been found yet. You're going to see some announcements about some of these being found as well. I think I hope the Marquette and Bessemer #2 is found soon. That's the big one on Lake Erie that just boggles the mind. The James Carruthers out on Lake Huron would also be nice to find. So that is my talk. I want to just thank everybody, and I'm going to stop the share, and then I'll come back for your questions. So thank you all for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. That was so fascinating. Yeah, our guests, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I guess I will start out with one of my own. So given that many of these wrecks will be found shortly, how do you feel about that? Does that like the search is over? You know, you've dedicated and are obviously very passionate about this. Um, what are your thoughts there?
I think it depends entirely on how they're found and who finds them. So I'm pretty passionate about it. I think it could be a good thing if they're found. But one of my, I guess, my pet peeves, if you will, is that these wrecks are often found by NOAA and turned over to the state historic preservation officer. And the state doesn't have to share those. They can sit on them forever. They don't have to look at them. They don't have to do any historical interpretation. Not saying they don't want to, but they don't have a big budget, in Michigan to do a lot of work on these wrecks. So if they're found by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, they will get a good storytelling. If they're found by Jerry Eliason and Ken Merriman, they will, or by Dan Fountain, or by myself. We tend to, document them, tell their stories, document what's on the bottom. We try to do photogrammetry models. We find the descendants of the victims of the accident, and we do a nice job because we're passionate about it. So I hope we find these. I don't think it's a bad thing when NOAA does, but then you know what? If NOAA finds it, say, well, we found it. They don't put out the numbers, they don't tell the story, and then everyone's like, well, why should I look for it? It's already been found,
Yeah.
right? So that's kind of how I feel about it. Mixed feelings.
Yeah, yeah. Somebody just suggested, could you file a Freedom of Information Act to get them to disclose some of the discoveries or?
No, they're covered under archaeological policies and they
Mhm.
cannot be FOIA'd. So in Wisconsin, for example, I found the wreck of the Trinidad, the wreck of the Margaret Muir, and the wreck of the John Evanson. And we filed, two of those have already been nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. The state does not have to release any of the information. I can tell the state the numbers for those wrecks safely, and the state does not have to disclose them, period, because they're archaeological sites. We will release them once they are listed on the National Register because that affords them additional legal protection.
Wow. Um, so somebody asked early on, and I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on this number, but estimate how many wrecks in the Manitou Passage.
Well, Ken Verana did a really nice inventory of the wrecks in the Manitou Passage quite a while ago. Ken's an old friend of mine. I don't know if you guys have a copy of his
We
excellent
do, yep.
book, but um, off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember how many are there. It's a choke point because a lot of vessels would go through there when they'd come from the straits. Some people would go around the other way, but the vast majority came through the passage. I know of the big ones that are still missing. There's not that many left that are still missing. Um, Probably, maybe 10 still missing in there, but there's a good number in general that were wrecked there because they came ashore on the Sleeping Bear, on the islands, on the Manitous. I would say hundreds. I'd have to look, honestly. I don't know off the top of my head how many, total wrecks are in the Manitou Passage, but it's a lot. There's good reference material on it. The one that comes to mind that I would like to find is the brig Robert Willis. It's early. It was lost in 1852. I wrote an article about it for Inland Seas. They accused the Mormons on Beaver Island of going out and sinking that ship and murdering the crew. And I don't think it's true. I think that ship will be found someday. It'll be very interesting when it's found.
Somebody asked, what kind of boat do you use? Length and brand? Do you use Garmin? And I'm curious to hear more about your homemade sonar.
Sure. So I'm not one of these guys that goes way out in the lake, right? That's Ken Merriman and the Hey Boy, or Great Lake Shipwreck Historical Society and the David Boyd. That it takes big boats. I have a 19-foot Starcraft Islander. It sleeps two. I take it out to Isle Royale every year for 8 nights with my wife, and we live on it. Very comfortable. And I have it tricked out for wreck hunting. And I'll take it 15 miles out in the lake. It's got radar on it. Now, as far as what I use for sonar, I've got a number of different sonars. I've got a deep vision deep eye that we just got, which is made in Sweden. That's a deep water model with a long cable, so you can get down below thermoclines and you can do deep searches with it. I also have a deep vision little eye, which is high frequency. It's got a 60-foot cable, and that's used for archaeological site mapping. I use that for taking high resolution images of wrecks to document, archaeologically document them. But the Wreck Sniffer Mark II, and there is a Wreck Sniffer Mark I that my partner Bob has, is a really interesting thing. I learned about them from Dan Fountain, who is watching your show right now. And Dan is one of my mentors. I learned a lot from him when I was a young man up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. Dan and I used to scuba dive together, and he started building his own sonars. And back then, and I learned from him that Garmin had released a rather low frequency transducer that normally mounts on your hull. But if you take that and mount it on homemade towfish and buy their extension cables, you can get it down in the water and get it away from the boat and underneath the turbulence on the surface and see much, much further. When we found the Trinidad, we found it with a Garmin and with a homemade towfish. We were going 6 miles an hour, and we were shooting a picture of the bottom 1,250 feet wide per channel. So that's 2,500 feet of bottom in each swath that thing was covering. And we found it at 6 miles an hour, and that was a 140-foot schooner, and it showed up just like a smudge. But we knew it was a smooth bottom, so we knew we had found it. You know what I mean? That kind of a unit is really useful. That's what most of the big finds have been made with, not with a big commercial sonar. The Great Lake Shipwreck Historical Society has a big marine sonic a commercial marine sonic that they use on the David Boyd, but the rest of us, Ken and Jerry, Dan, myself, Dusty Cliffman, we're all using Garmin, homemade Garmins, and boy, do they work, and for cheap.
Got lots of folks just thanking you for the great presentation. And we got one more that just popped up. Appreciate your time and sharing the knowledge. I share the feeling of the find to tell the story in the hunt for Marquette and Bessemer on Lake Erie.
Oh yeah, somebody has asked about the Chicora, if it's been located. So that's a controversial question because Taras Lysenko of A&T Recovery claimed he found it. He showed me the side scan image. I interviewed him on my podcast, and he's not one to say what you will. I don't think he's one to fib. I think he did find it. The hull that he showed on the side scan image is the right size. There shouldn't be anything else that size out there. Has he proven that it's the Chicora? Absolutely not. He didn't go down there. He was looking for lost airplanes at the time, so it was bycatch as far as he's concerned. But I do believe the Chicora has been found. Other people are looking for it, just like they're looking for the UC-97, the submarine off of Chicago, even though it's been found, because they're not releasing the numbers. And as far as I'm concerned, until you've released the location, told the story, documented the site, it ain't been found. Just saying you found it and showing a side scan image to me isn't enough. There's a responsibility that comes with searching for these and finding them. You can't be like a dog that chases a car, and you catch it and it breaks your neck, right? When you look for a wreck, you have not only a historical, and social responsibility, right? But not all of these wrecks have had positive outcomes to their discovery. Some have been looted, some have been damaged. So before you go looking, you need to have a plan. You need to know what you're going to do, and you need to have, a plan for telling the story. And you can't just go out there and blurt it out to everybody right away, because there are bad actors out there. And so all of us who look are all pretty ethical and we know what we're doing. So keep that in mind. If you're going to go look for these, there's a big social and historical responsibility.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I always try to remind people to, here in the Sleeping Bear Dunes area, there's tons of shore wrecks that people can easily go walk, take a hike and discover. And I often see photos of people, standing on pieces and they think it's cool and they're excited about the history. But then, you got to remind them this was probably the last and final resting place for, someone. Treat it as such.
Well, and the worst part is that, people used to cut it up for furniture, still do sometimes, or just burn them in bonfires. Just crazy. And these are really important. Even the fragmentary remains have stories to tell. So, for example, next week I'm releasing my book, Ghosts of the Oceana Coast, about the all the shipwrecks in Oceana County, Michigan. It's got over 60 ships in it. A lot of them, their stories have never before been told because I found their accounts of these wrecks doing my own original research, right? And most of the wrecks on that coast, Ludington, Manistee, Pentwater, White Lake, they're all beach wrecks. They're all schooners that in the lumber trade that drove ashore. But the vast majority of them still have extant remains that are under the beach, and some of them are relatively intact under the sandbars, but they never uncover. They're just buried in great condition too. They're like preserved under the sand. And so we shouldn't discount those ships. They have stories to tell. And the remains, even though fragmentary and under the beach, when they peak out, we try to measure them. And one of the things we're doing, the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association, is we're getting a magnetometer so we can outline the full extent of the wrecks under the sand and measure them by their magnetic signal so we can identify them, even without them being uncovered.
Wow, that's incredible. Someone says, can you elaborate a little bit on the laws that are protecting these wrecks?
Sure. So a lot of people don't know this. These Great Lakes wrecks have been protected since the 1950s and 60s, particularly in Michigan and Wisconsin, by state statute, because back in 1957, Michigan first described shipwrecks as being covered under their state archaeological statutes. Before that, it was all just, native grave sites and things like that. But in 57, they first said shipwrecks. Now, they didn't enforce it very, very widely. In 63, Wisconsin did likewise. But it wasn't until the Abandoned Shipwreck Act of 1987 that a big federal statute was passed. And then the states got serious about it and they funded enforcement by the DNR. And in some states, they actually hired a state underwater archaeologist and created an office of state underwater archaeologist. Usually around 88, 89, 90, that happened. And then the laws were enforced. So, generally a lot of times people say, well, I took it before 1987, so it was legal. No, if the state wants to prosecute you for it, they actually could. They don't usually, unless it's really egregious. But wrecks are protected by state statute, the same statutes that protect Indian burial sites. And, period. There are very few that are not covered. The Bentley is owned by Paul Ehorn. He won an admiralty case to own that wreck. The Lady Elgin was owned by Harry Zeik, who won an admiralty court ruling. Otherwise, historic wrecks are all owned by the states. The reason we nominate them to the National Register is to prevent people from filing an admiralty claim and getting ownership of them. Because if you take it to federal court and they can find an insurance company that insured it, they can often buy the rights, even though the insurance claim was paid 150 years ago. So we want to close that loophole. That's why we nominate them to the National Register.
Wow, yeah, I was not familiar with the that admiralty laws you were describing. So thanks for going into that. So I wanted to ask what month was the worst one? It looked, I think a lot of people think gales of November, but a lot of
Yeah.
those wrecks you went and talked about today were October.
Well, October can be pretty bad too, but November's statistically the worst. I actually did a breakdown. I actually should have put it in the slide. I have that data for all the Great Lakes. Roughly 30% of the wrecks are in November, and then 20% in October, and then September is a distant third. There's a little spike in May. Um, well, there's a reason for that. It's not just the weather, right? The reason there are so many wrecks is because November and October are when lumber has to be delivered, firewood has to be delivered, coal has to be delivered for heating houses, grain crop has to be delivered. All the fall harvest stuff has to happen, and that's when it all happens. It happens in late October and early November, and that's when the worst weather comes. So these ships had to go out. That was their busy season, right? And so the busiest season for these poor Great Lakes schooners, right, in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, just happened to coincide with the absolute worst weather. And they didn't have modern weather forecasting. They didn't know what they were going out into. They knew that it was going to be dangerous. It was like deadliest catch working on a Great Lakes vessel back then. You knew that you had a good chance of dying. But then again, you could die working in an iron foundry, or you could die as a lumberjack up in the woods. It was a different age than we have now. But yeah, absolutely October, November, with November really being a peak.
Somebody asked, which area of Lake Michigan is most underrated for shipwrecks? Which area of Lake Michigan do you feel needs more of its stories told in a book?
Ha, I'm glad you asked. Well, Pentwater, Oceana County, of course, and I just did. So watch for my book, Ghosts of the Oceana Coast. I'll be literally polluting social media with information about how to order, so you'll be able to see it on Facebook or wherever. But otherwise, an area that I think is underreported and doesn't have enough stories told about it is the beavers and the foxes. There's a big, interesting culture out there, from the Mormons to the Irish commercial fishermen. There's a lot of really colorful wrecks out there, and I have a manuscript in preparation about the shipwrecks of the beavers and the foxes. Now, I'll say this. There's a big concentration of wrecks between White Lake and Manistee. And not much gets told about those because they're under the beaches, but that's another interesting area. And I'll just lastly say that most of the wrecks are around the big cities. So Milwaukee and Chicago have this huge concentration of shipwrecks. I wrote about the wrecks of Milwaukee in Fathoms Deep, my book back in 2010. Nobody's really written anything comprehensive about the wrecks of Chicago, and there are hundreds. There's probably 300-400 wrecks around Chicago, and some amazing stories that have never been told or are lightly told. So anyway, those are my opinions. File them as that.
This book that you're coming out with, where will people be able to find it?
Well, you can buy it from me. Um, I'm about to order it. I just pre-ordered the first printing, and so I should be getting it in a couple of weeks. If you want to buy it, there's an online website for it. It is at shipwreck.info/Oceana, Oceana, shipwreck.info/Oceana. And you can order it there. I don't have copies yet, and so if you place an order, it's just going to be me holding it for you. I'm not accepting payments yet.
Well, it looks like we have answered everybody's questions. Thank you so much. This was so fascinating, and we're just glad you were available this evening. And I think everybody else really enjoyed it too. And it's wonderful to hear more about your research process too. We get a few, wreck hunters coming to our collection and to research, and it's always affirming to hear how much other historical organizations do to preserve this history. And it takes that huge network and explaining too to people that new data becomes available all the time. It's old history, but we're rediscovering it because these collections are getting digitized or made available.
You should consider, if you're not a member of the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History, look into it, aglmh.org. It's an excellent organization. All the major maritime museums and historical societies on the Great Lakes do a lot of networking, and we coordinate our efforts together through the AGLMH.
Yeah, I think your annual meeting or conference was hosted in Leelanau in 2019. I think we helped coordinate a few things there.
That's correct.
So yeah, that was really exciting. We love when we get the conferences to come to our home territory.
Very cool.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me. Have a nice evening, everybody.